that he's got an interest in big rockets. And I think that'd be really cool. So maybe we can get you back sometime to talk about that, because I think that'd be a lot of fun too. But today, we're going to talk about Linux distributions. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Bdale Garbee.
Well, it's kind of become tradition over the last couple of years for me to never give a presentation without sliding in at least one gratuitous rocket picture. So I promise you won't be completely disappointed. And who knows, I understand there's a Linux users group thing happening this evening. Those of you who hang around for that and pester me enough might actually, who knows, get a chance to see a few more things about rockets and why that's such an interesting connection, for me at least, to the world of open source. So what I want to do today is, if you were here this morning and listened to Zonker's presentation, you've got a few thoughts in mind perhaps about what's interesting right now, what's going on in 2011 that maybe makes it a little bit different from open source of the preceding few years. I want to sort of focus that discussion just a little bit on what's happening in the Linux distribution space. I am not the kind of person who throws around lots of numbers, so don't worry, this is not all about analyst data of which distribution has eked a little bit ahead of another. Not at all. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the mechanics of the community development process, how that leads to these things we call Linux distributions, how we at HP think about the distribution landscape. A couple of things that we've done that I think are unique within the industry in terms of promoting freedom of choice among our Linux using customer base. And then I'll end up talking just a little bit about the thing that's sort of the newest addition to my personal list of activities. I fear I'm one of those people who sort of epitomizes the old adage that if you want something done, ask a busy man. So who am I exactly? Well, out of curiosity, how many of you have heard me give a talk somewhere before? Yes, Mad Dog, I know. Well, this is wonderful. Part of the reason I was pleased to be invited here is that I've never been to Columbia before. In fact, I've spent very little time in this part of the country in the last couple of decades. I grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, which somehow seems a whole lot closer to here than Colorado, where I live now, both geographically and in lots of other ways. I do know the difference between Eastern and Western North Carolina barbecue, for example. But I've been doing this free software thing for a very long time. I tell people I made my first personal contribution of source code in about 1979. It was a little piece of assembly language for a then very obscure and now completely forgotten microprocessor system. But it got published in a newsletter of a computer users group in Canada when I was in high school and didn't have a driver's license yet. And not surprisingly, when I was invited by the club president to come be the program for one of their monthly club meetings, my parents didn't really think that was sort of the thing it was worth getting a passport and traveling to another country for. But I learned very quickly, at a very early age, this fundamental lesson that if you do something interesting and you're willing to share it with other people, that the result of that collaborative development process can be a really wonderful thing. I've had the pleasure for the last almost 10 years, actually. Woke up this morning realizing it was May of 2001 when I returned to HP. I've had the pleasure for almost a decade now of serving as HP's open source and Linux chief technologist. And what that means is I spend a lot of my day helping to guide the various business units in HP in their thinking about this whole Linux and open source process, both in terms of how they should productively collaborate with and participate in open source development communities, but also how we can take advantage of the processes and the methodologies that have come out of the open source world to better advantage internally. Those of you who have heard of me before probably know me mostly because of my role since about 1994 in the Debian distribution. I have served as Debian project leader in the past, and I will echo Zonker's observation this morning that the fact that Stefano is running unopposed for re-election as Debian project leader is very much a manifestation of the fact that things in the project are going very well, and he is a brilliant choice at this moment in history for a Debian project leader. I like him a lot, he's doing a great job, and with any luck, he'll be re-elected. I do currently continue to maintain a number of Debian packages myself. It's part of how I keep my fingernails as grubby as possible, and I'm chairman of the Debian Technical Committee. But along the way, I've also ended up taking on some roles with various nonprofit organizations that are part of the open source ecosystem. Probably the most interesting ones to me off the list of things that I do are that I serve as president of Software in the Public Interest, which is a nonprofit that provides legal and financial existence services for Debian and for other substantial open source projects like freedesktop.org, openoffice.org. We're actually right in the process now of approving associated project status for LibreOffice. Be interesting to sort of see how that transition plays out. I'm a member of the board of the Linux Foundation. You know, they give me nice shirts once in a while. And for the last year and a half, I've had the pleasure of being a member of the board of the Linux Foundation, representing individual members and developers on the board, as opposed to representing my employer, which has been an interesting shift and something I can talk about later if people are interested. And then about a week and a half ago, a press release went out announcing that I had agreed to join the board of the Freedom Box Foundation and to serve as chairman of its technical advisory board. I'll wrap up the presentation this morning by talking just a little bit about what that means and why I think it's interesting in the context of distributions. And of course, you know, I've built pieces of amateur satellites, and my current passion is high-powered model rocketry. This is one of my little rockets. It's one of the ones I can actually carry by myself, and that's my son following along with the igniter. And you know, the whole rocket thing is just kind of a passion for me, but it has also spun off an interesting little activity that I'm doing with, interestingly enough, some other long-time participants in the open source world. We're developing completely open hardware and open source avionics for use in the high-power model rocketry world. My lead software developer is none other than Keith Packard, the chief architect of the X Windows system for the last couple of decades. And so it's an interesting, as I said, convergence of trying to bring some open source into the rocketry world and giving us all an excuse to go do something fun on weekends after conferences when we manage to get invited to places that are close to rocket launches. Okay, so enough about me. Enough about all of that stuff. If we're going to talk about Linux distributions, I think it's important to start with sort of a common foundation and basis in how distributions happen and how they work. And to do that, I'm very fond of going back and sort of looking at the fundamental definitions that lead to the kinds of relationships and behaviors that we all exhibit in this process. And one of the key concepts is this concept of community. We talk about community development. We talk about the open source community, or as Bob brightly pointed out in the last session, it's actually not a community, it's a community of communities, a very complex set of network interactions between lots of different people who have entirely different motivations. If you go back to the sort of dictionary definition of community, though, I think we all sort of intrinsically understand what that means. It's a group or body of people who have a common set of rights or privileges or interests, in many cases living in the same place under similar laws and regulations. And if you think about it, we are all members of lots of different communities. It might be the church that we attend. It might be the community of parents who are involved with a sport that our child is involved in or interested in. It might be that we're alumni of a particular educational institution and we love to get together around sporting events and root for the good guys and holler at the bad guys. But what happened with the emergence of the internet is that a new class of communities was created that really had not existed before. And as with all assertions, there are examples that you can point to that refute the fact that it had never existed before. But this was really the first time that broadly people with common interests or values who are potentially very geographically distributed were able to come together and to work collaboratively in large numbers on projects that were of interest to them. And the reason this is important is that one of the things that they all agreed to work on was software. And out of this came this thing we now call the community development model, which is a key attribute of how Linux and most open source applications are developed. And what does this community development model really mean? Well, it means that there's no single company in charge. There may be specific open source development communities that are working on a piece of software that are backed by some specific company. A good example would be something like MySQL, where originally it was a company called MySQL that provided support and services for that particular database product. They, of course, got acquired by Sun, which had some interesting consequences. They got acquired by Oracle with even more interesting and not necessarily so positive consequences. But in general, open source is something that brings together a range of contributors with varied interests, abilities, from widely different geographic, economic, and cultural backgrounds, all of whom share some common interest and a will to work together to make interesting things happen. One of the reasons that these people can all participate and collaborate together is that we have evolved a set of licenses that have a set of attributes that basically lower the barrier to entry into participation. The common element of all open source licenses is the notion that any user can and should be able to become a developer if they want to.